Hey everyone. So I wanted to talk about something which I'm honestly pretty reluctant to talk about because this is something that I don't spend a lot of time reflecting on. And also, a lot of people in my life don't necessarily know about this. A lot of my friends don't know about it. Some of my family doesn't know about it. And some do, but the most don't. But even though this is embarrassing, I do think it's important to be open about things like this, especially if you're struggling with something similar. You could sort of learn from my experience and take heart in the fact that other people have been through what you've been through. And I do want to show that there is value in being open about something like this, even though it is kind of confronting aspects of my past which I prefer not to think about. And that is the fact that for a long period of time, I suffered from severe social anxiety that caused me to be completely dysfunctional and ended up causing a lot of damage in my life. Because of this, I couldn't really make good decisions, and I felt like my life was almost like on autopilot, and I was completely isolated from other people, which entails a lot of loneliness, but also a huge amount of dysfunction, because that's one of the things about anxiety is that it makes it very hard to function as a human because you're always seeking ways to lessen the feeling of anxiety, and so you never really do anything productive. But you also learn rather quickly that you need other people to function, not just like on a day-to-day basis, but also socially. It's a basic biological need to connect with other people, and social anxiety can make that almost impossible. The first signs that I had an anxiety problem came when I was in middle school and I moved to a new area. And many of the students at my school came from a very wealthy background. And one of the results of this was the fact that it was a very hyper competitive environment. Everybody was obsessed with their grades because they were told in their households that grades were the most important thing ever. And given the way the education system was set up, you would obviously come to that conclusion. And I also met people whose parents would basically withdraw any sort of affection unless they did well in school. Obviously, that's not the majority, but it just shows like how hyper competitive this environment was. But right away, my own attitude just sort of clashed with this. I didn't think that grades were that valuable or that meaningful. I was somewhat of an idealist, but I also thought that there were super obvious and glaring flaws in the schooling system that were having a very bizarre effect on the students and their psychology. And I was one of those kids who questioned everything and just questioned the system. But I was also very arrogant, and because of this, I thought that I was smarter than everybody else. But even though I felt like I could see through the system, whenever I brought this up with other people, they would all just look at me like I was crazy. In general, when there's a pervasive attitude amongst a group of people, you tend to look crazy when you have something different to say. Now, looking back on this, I shouldn't be surprised. I mean, after all, how else are middle schoolers supposed to think other than to trust their parents and teachers? But at the time, it felt like the fact that I was thinking so differently put up a barrier between me and other people. I also wanted to have discussions about taboo topics like religion and stuff, and naturally people found that very strange. But the fact that I was having ideas and thoughts that no other person had any interest in caused me to feel very isolated. And because I felt so isolated, I felt like the only way for me to fit in was to conceal many of my thoughts and not to talk about the things that I thought were interesting or thought-provoking, and just sort of blend in with the general vibe and talk about the Super Bowl or whatever. I too started to become very obsessed with my grades and starting to believe that they were the only thing that mattered. But at the same time, I also felt this sense of conflict between what I was expressing outwardly and what I was feeling and thinking internally. I felt like it was necessary to censor myself, but a consequence of this was that I felt like I was never free to speak my mind, because if I did, people would quickly think that I was a freak. And honestly, in a way, they were right. Relative to the general attitude, I was kind of an outlier. Whereas now I see that as a positive thing. Back then, I saw it as something to be ashamed of. I felt like I needed to actively hide huge portions of who I was in order to fit in. And, this was out of fear of being labeled a weirdo. Funny enough, I was still considered weird and awkward, so that tactic clearly didn't work. And this feeling caused me to be withdrawn from other people. I still had my group of friends who I was fairly close with, but as I went into my last year of high school, I started to become very withdrawn, and I didn't want to interact with others. I became more and more introverted, and I was often more comfortable alone with my own thoughts rather than with other people. But because I was spending so much time alone in my own bubble, I began to gradually fear all social situations. And I began to fear having to introduce myself to other people. Because I was so self-aware of how strange and awkward I was. And I always had this feeling that people could tell right away that there was something wrong with me. And because I was so scared to talk to people, I never sought out advice from others. And because I never spoke to people, nobody ever caught on to the fact that I was struggling with this immense social anxiety. If I reached out for help, maybe I could have gotten it, but just because I was so afraid of talking to people, nobody was aware of this. And furthermore, I never really got the information I needed in order to function in the world. I didn't know what I needed to do in order to achieve my goals. I was just, like I said before, I was just running on autopilot. And one of the things I want to make clear is that it wasn't merely just fear, because whenever I would feel anxious and have this anxiety around social situations, I would always justify it to myself and think, well, I'm just so smart, or, I don't need other people's advice, which is a very toxic way to justify something which was clearly a problem. Around the time of high school, I started to have immense difficulty in school because it was impossible for me to focus even for just 5 minutes. I would sit in class and try to pay attention to what was going on in the lecture, but 30 minutes would pass by and then I would suddenly realize that I had just followed a random thought train that was completely irrelevant. But of course, because I was scared to talk to people, including my teachers and my guidance counselors, I never communicated that I was actually struggling greatly in school. Since then I was diagnosed with ADHD, but it would have been pretty helpful if I knew it back then. And this is why social anxiety can be such a trap, is because you never build up the courage to actually communicate your problems, and then you pretty much just suffer in silence. And the barrier that I put up around myself and other people made it so that I basically had nobody who really knew me. Not a single person actually knew who I was. People would see someone, but it wasn't who I really was. Outwardly, I was a very different person than what I was thinking internally. And again, the person I was pretending to be outwardly was the person who was trying to conceal the fact that I thought that I was such a freak. And again, this was all out of fear of being judged for my weirdness, for my own self-perceived weirdness. And so anybody I interacted with, I always had this feeling that there's no way this person even knows me. Even though I really wanted to communicate my thoughts and the things that I was thinking, the things that I found interesting. And this became worse and worse as I moved on from high school to university. Even though I was insecure in high school, I still had a group of friends who I was very lucky to have. But in university is where my social anxiety really became crippling. So I went to university, and I went to a different university than most of my friends. And it's something that I didn't even really look into because, again, it was hard for me to talk to the necessary people to actually know and make a proper decision. My goal was to become a veterinarian, but, without this information, I didn't really understand what that entailed. In other words, my social anxiety pretty much cut me off from all useful information. And when I go to university, I have an immense amount of difficulty, working up the courage to actually speak to anybody because of how much anxiety I felt in these social situations. So in residence, I ended up making not a single friend. I would pretty much just hide in my room and watch Netflix as a way to keep myself distracted, while everyone else on my floor was, getting to know each other. Now, of course, because of the way I was acting, and intentionally isolating myself, everybody around me started to see me as a stranger, and rumors began to circulate about me. And, to an extent, I knew that I had done this to myself because of the way I was acting and the way I was so antisocial. It's easy to regard somebody like that as a freak. The amount of anxiety I felt was so bad at a point that I would get extremely scared just seeing somebody, coming the other way down the hall, because I wouldn't know what to do. Should I wave at them? Should I smile? Should I just ignore them and keep walking? I started to almost like panic and then be so relieved when they would just walk by. And because my social anxiety was so severe, I started to really resent myself, especially since deep down I really did want to make friends and I really did want to connect with other people, but this fear, this stupid pervasive fear, would just prevent me from doing that. And I began to think that I was extremely weak and contemptible. I mean, I couldn't even work up the courage to just say hello to a person, and I began to really hate myself, and I began to really hate the fact that I was like this. And the more I was disengaged from other people, the less I knew about how to even interact with people. Eventually that skill just atrophied. I didn't understand basic social customs. And this is again what I mean by the fact that social anxiety caused a huge amount of dysfunction. I know it sounds weird, but you really do forget how to have a conversation if you don't put it into practice. And so for the entire time I was at university, I basically made no friends. There were a couple people here and there, and I did have some friends who were from high school, and they became kind of my go-to people to hang out with. But for the most part, I basically met nobody new. And none of my family or my friends knew about this. I would just go home and pretend like everything was okay when really I was struggling and very depressed. And obviously a natural consequence of this is that I was extremely lonely. Every day I would just finish classes, go straight to my room, close the door, and watch YouTube videos. I really began to use the internet as a way to distract myself from my anxiety. And as a result, I wasn't even a great student. And this of course led to an extremely toxic cycle because I had no ability to reach out and ask for help. And so this problem just became worse and worse. I recall so many situations where I told myself, okay, today's the day. I'm going to go out and meet new people. I'm going to go out and say hello to somebody and strike a conversation. And I would just go out, and then fear would grip me and get the better of me. And then I would just end up walking back home feeling completely depressed. I remember going for club sign-up days, and just walking around the club booths thinking every time, okay, this time is going to be the time I'm going to go up to this person and ask them to join their club so that I can finally meet people and make friends. But every single time the same thing would happen where I would just go home defeated because I couldn't build up the courage needed to just talk to a single person. Right? It sounds kind of ridiculous because how could somebody have such a fear of just talking to one person? But it was completely there for me. And every time that was happen, I would just feel this overwhelming sense of resentment towards myself. And one of the reasons I'm so embarrassed by this is because it doesn't seem like such a big issue. Like, people suffer from anxiety for very real and tangible reasons, and which are much more serious. And so, back then, I just thought that the reason that I was struggling is because I was weak. And that I didn't need anybody's help because, again, nobody would help me either way. But this dysfunction became so acute that I would even have trouble just going out and buying basic necessities because I was scared to go out in public and be seen. I was even scared to talk to the cash register. And so many nights I would just stay in my room and not eat because of this social fear. And I remember waking up really early in the morning so I can go shower just to avoid coming into contact with anybody. In the few instances where I was invited to parties, I would go and immediately feel this sense of dread. And people could see it in me as well. I was stuttering, I was shaking, I was sweating profusely. Nothing I said made sense. I was inarticulate. And sometimes I couldn't even understand what other people were saying because of how much fear there was. Whenever I heard people laughing, I just immediately assumed that they must be laughing at me. I remember one time, after 30 minutes, I immediately left a party and just sat in my car, absolutely hating myself and begrudging the person I was. And just begging myself, like, why can't I be normal? Why can't I just be like everybody else? Additionally, because I had no friends in my program, I didn't know exactly what I was doing in university. I didn't exactly understand the path to become a veterinarian. I was pretty much left in the dark about so many opportunities that would have been helpful. Reflecting back now, it honestly felt like every event in my life was like a dice roll, that I had no control over everything because fear would be controlling me. And the fear always just pushed me back whenever I try to work up the courage. And I began to really, really struggle. So you might be wondering, like, how I overcame this fear, or whether I overcame this fear, because honestly, it's still there and I still feel it to an extent. But I began to realize that the core problem was the fact that I wanted to fit in with other people, and so that entailed concealing exactly who I was. But I realize now that this is completely the wrong attitude. Sacrificing who you are to blend in is never worth it, and it always leads to neuroticism. And the mistake I made was thinking that such a sacrifice was necessary. If somebody else thinks that I'm weird, that's their problem. I always find that the more unique individuals have much richer and engaged perspectives, and help to show me ideas that I would have otherwise never considered. Slowly, I began to realize that my individuality is actually an asset and not something that I should be ashamed of. It's something that could help me stand out. And I considered the possibility that maybe I didn't need to conceal myself anymore, because I identified this as being a prime cause of my anxiety. I began talking about things which interested me. I was also open to the things that made other people unique. Their own uniqueness in strangers was not something I wanted them to shy away from, and I've learned to encourage it in other people, because if I don't accept other people's individuality, why should I expect anybody to accept mine? As for the lack of confidence, I began to learn that confidence is a skill. It's something that needs to be practiced, and I began to really dig into the psychology of confidence and the biology of confidence and learn what it actually meant to be confident. And so I would practice by myself, be just having a normal conversation and letting my mind flow and just letting the fear pass rather than trying to immediately do something to lessen the fear. And when I began to do this, I realized how stuck I had been inside my own head. I'd been thinking so many things that it never occurred to me to say these things out loud. I realized how trapped I was inside my own mind. And it was such a joy for me to actually be able to just say what I wanted to say and realize that, people were sometimes interested, and even if they weren't interested, it wasn't my problem. And while I'm still dealing with many regrets about my past, I don't feel that regret that intensely, because partly all of these negative experiences have shaped the person who I am today. And I know that so many people have learned from my experiences, and I've helped so many people who've had similar problems to me. And furthermore, all of that dread and anxiety that I felt and all of that suffering that I felt has led me here to this point where I can just talk openly about whatever I want to say. And there are people who want to listen, which is such a privilege. Now, I want my experiences in the past not to just be something that happened to me, but rather something which other people can learn from and which other people can benefit from. Because I know that many people do struggle from this confidence issue and struggle from social anxiety, and many of you suffer in silence because, again, social anxiety makes it hard to speak out about what's happening to you. And that's why, as many of you have seen, I started a new coaching service through which I wanted to share what I learned and experienced and tailor it to meet your specific needs. Just from this experience with anxiety, I've learned so much about depression, addiction, internal conflicts, being true to yourself, and living up to the standards that you set up for yourself. And I want to help people live the best possible lives that they can. And of course, if you're doing well, the light that you generate will radiate outwards. And so the world becomes slightly less shittier just from you helping yourself. I've also decided to cut the price of my service in half because I realize that cost can be such a barrier for some people who don't have the resources necessarily. And I want to help as many people as possible. So again, if you're in a position where you feel like something in your life, inside your psyche, is preventing you from living the life that you really want, and if you're struggling in silence, please consider reaching out to me. You can do so for free, and we can have a 30-minute conversation. But yeah, I hope you learned from my experience. It was kind of hard to open up, but if you know anything about Jungian psychology, you would know that opening up is an important kind of part of growth. But anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.